presentation actually comes from a panel of speakers, including Hassan, who's speaking there, so looking forward to hearing more from him. So it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome them all. This presentation draws on the work of the GCRF Research Network, Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures, which focuses on socially and environmentally just education for climate action, decent work and sustainable cities. So this project is supporting up to 80 Southern-led projects in Rwanda, Somalia or Somaliland, South Africa and India. And the presentation itself will feature 4 speakers representing several of the programme partners. So we have Dr. Rafael Mitchell from the University of Bristol, Dr. Injairu Kulundu-Bolus from Rhodes University in South Africa, Dr. Michael Tusiime from University of Rwanda, and Professor Hassan Okaya from University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And they're bringing a range of knowledge, expertise and perspectives to this important discussion. So over to you, team.
Thank you. Can I just check, can you see my screen? You can see the slides. Okay, great.
Yes.
Yes, great. So over the next 20 minutes, we're going to be talking a bit about our international research network, Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures, specifically the work that's going on in the African continent in the context of COVID-19. And you can see from this introductory slide the number of different institutions and actors that are involved in this network around the world. So what is our network about? So TESF, as Lauren mentioned, is it's GCRF funded network. University of Bristol is the lead institution, but we have partners around the world. And specifically, we've got national research hubs, which have been established in India, Rwanda, Somalia, Somaliland, and South Africa. And we'll be focusing on the African ones today. As Lauren mentioned, the aim of TSF is to fund around 80 Southern-led research projects in the countries that we've mentioned, which are going to be focusing on transforming education systems, especially with a focus on sustainable livelihoods and cities and communities and climate action. So that's the hope. The emphasis across all of this research is on social and environmental justice, and particularly for historically and marginalized groups and those most affected by poverty. And I think that's why we've been invited to talk at this BPI event today. So in common with most GCRF work, as far as I know, there's kind of dual purposes for this network. Firstly, it's about research for transformation, specifically in the area of education policy and practice. But the idea is that this is transformative research. It's kind of interdisciplinary, or in fact, transdisciplinary research, which is research for impact rather than purely basic academic research. But the second element of this is that it's about mobilizing capacities to conduct research and have action as a result of that research. So those are the kind of twin objectives of this research. Now, in common with everyone, our activities have been disrupted by COVID-19, and so earlier this year, it was decided that we would suspend our kind of action plan and divert money towards the research hubs so they could do their own research in relation to how education was being affected by this pandemic. So we'll be reporting on that in this presentation. But before I move on, I just want to really emphasize it in common with, as Isabella and Hassan have already mentioned, we're talking about really diverse contexts here. And in terms of research, and specifically education research, these are very different context. There's a very different research landscape in the education space. So South Africa is the foremost country in the continent in terms of education research outputs, right at the top there. Rwanda is around the middle in terms of its research productivity in the field of education. And Somalia, as you can see, like on this map, has really amongst the countries with the fewest research outputs in the area of education. So that gives some indication of kind of the current capacity in terms of education research. But I'm going to hand over now to Professor Hassan Okaya, who's going to be talking broadly about the African. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Rafael. As I introduce myself, my name is Hassan Okaya. I'm the director of the DSI, Department of Science and Innovation, National Research Foundation Center in Indigenous Knowledge Systems with its hub at University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. They're located in Durban. I mean, I've been given the assignment to set the scene in our contribution. The most important thing, I point out a number of highlights in the sense that our contribution is meant to give some new paradigm shifts in the way we conceptualize global challenges such as pandemics like COVID-19, and we conceptualize poverty, we conceptualize educational transformation and social justice. I would like to start by saying that just as pandemics tend to be looked in biological terms, I mean, poverty also is not just an economic issue. It involves social, cultural, spiritual, environmental dimensions, which people tend to marginalize. And these have important aspects in the terms of research and in terms of also human capital and community engagement, because it necessitates our approach to research, including human capital development in terms of multi-transbusiness approaches. In other words, in order to look at in a holistic approach, it gives us also a holistic understanding of what poverty is all about. Because even here in Africa, people conceptualize poverty differently from the way people from other cultural backgrounds look at us. And another important aspect, which I think Isabel pointed at the last part of her presentation, is people also, because they are marginalized in spite of their socio-economic positions or in the social groups, they want their voices to be heard. So that policy strategies should be based on the authentic expression of their own conditions, not from Bristol or from Harvard or from somewhere else. They want their voices to be heard. How do they understand poverty themselves? And how from their own conceptualization of poverty, of pandemics, try to create their own strategies for survival. And that's what we call building on the indigenous, building on what people themselves understand what poverty is, what pandemics affect them, and how they can impact on their lives. So that is setting the scene. And then I'm supposed to also to contribute to how initially I was supposed to focus on South Africa, how COVID-19 impacted on Africa. But later on during our discussion, we thought that most of the issues which affect South Africa here, although it's the most unequal society, a country in the world, but there are a lot of commonalities in most of African countries. That when pandemic came up in COVID-19, especially at the beginning of the year, what governments did in the continent here was to close abruptly all the educational institutions at all levels. And this exposed and worsened the existing digital divide between social groups and communities. You find that the historical advantaged institutions in South Africa, including social groups, had no contingent plans in place due to lack of capacity, because the closure was abruptly. Most of the pupils come from poor families also they're poor, unemployed. They didn't have any contingencies to adjust themselves to the visual learning environments. And also you find that most of the parents were now supposed to take care of their children as teachers. Most of them, they don't have the capacity to be formal teachers. That was also another important problem COVID-19 brought to South Africa and many other African countries. So you find the learners, teachers, and parents, and also civil society also experienced drastic budget changes or cuts, and not only in education, but in other sectors as well, with a devastating impact on realizing, for instance, in South Africa, basic education as a constitutional right, because what was happening in terms of budget cuts and what the constitution was saying were totally contradictory. And learners and teachers also, you know, we live in an African environment, when here in South Africa, a number of people live also in most African countries, live in rural areas. In the rural areas, that social connectedness is part and parcel of life. So telling people to not to go to school where they've got their friends there, or social distancing or physical distancing, something un-African. So it also brought all those contradictions in the daily life of a lot of people, both learners, teachers, and also families. And the budget cuts also exposed one important aspect, the dependence character of formal education in Africa. So that is also an important aspect, in the sense that because most of the education in Africa here is formal, Western oriented, depends on most of teaching material on things which you need money. Right? So once you are cut off, the budget cuts is a problem. And that emphasizes that building on the indigenous promotes self-reliance, and also emphasizes the importance complementarity of knowledge system, especially the importance of indigenous knowledge systems, which are more relevant where theory and practice are combined. I think I should stop there.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Injairu Kulundu-Bolus. I'll be continuing from there. My 5 furious minutes that I have, in my 5 furious minutes, I want to start off by just emphasizing the point that COVID-19 exacerbated existing challenges, especially as they pertain to food security, access to water, and ongoing economic precarity. And just to throw into the pot a discussion around other dimensions of poverty and that we've been witnessing, particularly at this time, at this heightened time, I would like to speak about the poverty of information that we've been witnessing, especially when quite a Western discourse of COVID-19 landed into the space in quite an untranslated way. I'd like to speak about the poverty of trust that exists, or rather even a trust deficit between people and their government, which of course is an inherited state of affairs from apartheid, but also when you think about contemporary South African government, and its difficulty in engaging meaningfully with its people. You know, the poverty of trust is there. And of course, when we speak about South Africa and its inequalities, there is a poverty of connectedness across the poles that's sitting there. And I think linking to what Prof. Kaya was speaking about, there's also poverty of quite a grounded context-based alternatives. We keep hearing that we should be responding from our own place. And alternatives that can build a vision of the future beyond the pandemic, or as we've been speaking about here, what it means to build back better. So in my 5 minutes, I'm going to share a little bit more of the informal learning that's been happening this year. Some of what we've gained insight of that's been very, very interesting. And I'm going to be focusing on looking at the community action networks that have generated in response to COVID-19. And in order for me to do so, I have to flip the conversation from poverty to speak about the social richness that makes the work that we've been witnessing possible. How it's been quite incredible to recognize and witness those that have always showed up for the work, those that have always worked to feed each other and secure each other beyond the state. I'm talking about the champions hidden in plain sight, community feeding schemes, for example, that have been in existence for a long time. And they actually really focused us, I think, quite strongly into the work that needed to be done. And what we were able to see in this time is how other social just the work in meaningful ways. And I think that what we've been able to see from the community action networks, whether they've been long-standing community-based organizations or those that are rising to respond to the situation, is very useful experiments in recognizing our inherent capacity to respond otherwise to Corona. I want to speak particularly about the work of Cape Town Together and the Eastern Cape Together example. And I really think that what needs to be celebrated here in terms of the work that they've been pulling through is ways to reimagine educational engagements during the pandemic in very relatable and accessible and embracing ways. I think a lot of the bulk of the work I was speaking to my colleagues was speaking about how we needed to translate scientific information into accessible and comprehensible ways so that people can respond in their context. I want to share a little bit of what the dissonance felt like in terms of what the languaging of the virus came with. For example, just the emphasis on washing your hands. What does washing your hands mean in context where access to water has been a long time struggle? Or the metaphor of flattening the curve. How else do we speak about exponential infection rates in the world? The big one is social distancing, and my colleagues earlier have already spoken about the spatial assumptions and who can have the space of social distance, but also the cultural stuff that comes with willfully moving yourself away from people and how to mitigate that. So I think the work of the Eastern Cape Together team and the Cape Town Together team on the first hand was really about clearing a path through a miasma of information and also misinformation and conflicting news that the pandemic gave rise to. But just to give a picture of the kind of work that has been able to come up, and the learning communities that have been on the go doing a lot of work as a response to Corona-19, there's been a massive mobilization around community food kitchens and in response to the economic precarity, of course. And many people speak about food security as the second pandemic. Sure, we have Corona, but the second pandemic is food security, and massive uprising in terms of people making sure that their communities, all those little on the image you're seeing are different communities responding in that way. And this is very important, not just for those who already relied on these food security systems, but the new people who are experiencing the economic precarity, as well as out of learners who were suddenly out of the safety of the nutritional support that school was providing for them. But what's been very interesting to notice is how the movement around the food kitchens started moving into sustainable conversations, and what we began to see a lot of community garden being created as a result of that, which is so interesting. It's like, what do we need next in order to be able to support ourselves, right? There's also been interesting examples of community care centers as an alternative to the state-based responses that often were not trusted or didn't work too well, especially by those experiencing the stigma of COVID-19. And so all in all, I really feel that the work that has been rising in this time has been very interesting in looking at how we can activate our capabilities during the pandemic, and how to foster a very embodied local intellectual engagement. I don't mean intellectual, I mean like a grounded way of working with what's in front of us in a way that really fosters ownership. Just in closing, I want to add two other examples to give you a way of looking into the world of the work that we're seeing. And the first one relates to the work of young people. When Isabella was speaking, there was I think COVID's been very interesting in the way that it's been very clear about those who risk, yeah? And so it makes sense that we're talking about the elderly, but also, and also on the youngest continent in the world. I feel like there's been almost a failure to conceptualize what youth responsibility could look in that context. And so I really want to celebrate the work of a group called Amava Oluntu, and they managed to create a youth-led kind of learning space where the critical questions that young people were asking about society and the world could be mobilized in ways that they could get involved, start their own alternative community kitchens, and use it as a space to ask further questions about a future that's worthy of their longing. And they've been launching a lot of other participatory video practices and lots of a youth hub. So it's almost a sense like the pandemic has created a space for them to assert their futures, assert the authentic ways in which they would like to live. And that's quite powerful to see. And then lastly, my last point, I guess connected to the aspect of the poverty of connectedness, it's been very interesting to watch the middle class arrivals in the most unequal country in the world. And here I really want to talk about what it's been like to witness in real time what it's looked like to learn to participate across the poles, beyond the paradigms of charity, beyond hierarchical and patriarchal ways, how to learn to move together in decentralized ways. And I think this is very interesting in terms of the conversation of building back better, because it asks questions about what social solidarity could mean if we ethically rewire our ways of working. And there've been lots of interesting conversations and confrontations that have been happening in collaboration that really give insight into the whole effort of building back better. So these are some of the, in terms of the community action networks that have existed and that have come up, these are some of the things that are really interesting for us in the South African context that we want to support deep reflection for, so that we can build on going forward. Thank you. I'll hand over to you, Michael.
Hello, I'm Michael Tusiime. I'm a lecturer at the University of Rwanda College of Education, and I'm also a co-investigator on the TESF project here. Now, I can't agree more with Professor Kaya and Injairu when they talked about the widening digital gaps between families, especially the vulnerable families and those that are able, especially during the COVID times and the school lockdowns. You have children who possibly have never gone or never learned anything school-related since the lockdown. And for the case of Rwanda, it happened in March 21st to be precise. And now Rwanda decided to facilitate children continue learning through remote learning. And by this, I mean, we had scripted lessons that were aired on TVs and on radios. But then some preliminary research indicated that a significant number of the children from vulnerable families were not doing any learning because they lacked the radio in the first case. They didn't have TV. So you have one kid who somehow continued learning since the lockdown in March. You have another kid who has never learned anything. I mean, when I say learned anything, I mean school related, because learning can be so broad. Our project here is phrased in two phases. One, we sought to work with communities to identify the most vulnerable families who have children in basic education, but have not been able to access remote learning because they didn't have facilities. The project was able to secure 2,467 solar-powered radios, and these have been distributed to families. Now, children from such families are now able to participate in remote learning, but inequalities remain because these children have not been able actually to catch up on what they've lost. But on the other hand, the teachers that are expected to provide remedial measures also have issues. They're also taking care of their families, but there are also issues of capacity. How do you provide remedial to a kid who has missed all the learning for the past 5 months? And remember, these are going to be back together in the with the local communities, with the districts, with Rwanda Education Board, with other civil society organizations. And the phase 2 of the research is actually going to explore the following questions. It's already started, but we don't have findings yet. One, we're going to analyze what opportunities and challenges do communities experience as they negotiate their children's continuity to learn and working to provide for the basics. I think one of the speakers earlier talked about families that have found themselves in contradictions. Am I able to support the kid, or can I totally get consumed in finding the basics for the kid? And this is a challenge. And now the second aspect is that we're going to be able to analyze how can existing local communities and structure be empowered to proactively support children's learning during the post-COVID-19, and how best they can tap into what is already existing in their communities. I think Professor Kaya mentioned this one very eloquently. I can't repeat that. Society has a lot to teach, and I think we better tap into what is already there as we integrate new aspects. Then how have formal education systems and informal and public education practices responded to the pandemic, and with impact to their disadvantaged groups? And then what forms of curricula? I mean, we went to open schools, but what kind of curricular modifications do we have to do? If COVID has taught us lessons, can we integrate the lessons that we've been taught by COVID, unfortunately, into our curricula? We are talking about issues of social capital. How do you incorporate issues of empathy, issues of trust, issues of care into the curricula? Because if COVID has taught us anything, I think these are very critical social capital issues that we need to integrate. Then the other component is what is needed for education institutions to safely reopen schools in a way that promotes access and learning of disadvantaged groups. The challenge that we've all had, and I think it's not particular to Rwanda, we go mainstream. And mainstream is not, just like it sounds, it's not all stream. And these are things that we're going to have to be careful about. And then, of course, what lessons can we draw from COVID? This one I said earlier, to inform our curricula. Next. And then, yes, how have informal education systems and informal, I think I mentioned this, Rafael.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Thank you. Let me.
I want to be very sure here that as I conclude this one, I think we are collective societies, you know, and I think in situations where we don't have institutional social support mechanisms, I think we need to tap into what communities already have. I'm not saying we disregard, but there's a lot of capital within societies that can help us propel, especially as we emerge out of this monster. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just briefly going to report on the Somalia and Somaliland research, which has gone.
So, apologies, just to let you know, Rafael, you are already over the time for your Q&A as well. So if you could just be as brief as possible, just so we can get on to our next speaker and we don't run out of time, if that's all right.
Sure. Okay, Lauren. Well, in that case, I won't report on this research, but I will direct you to this fantastic report, which is the bottom left-hand side of your screen there, which is a really great report, which has been conducted over the summer, giving some really valuable insights on the current education system in Somalia and Somaliland, and also the population's hopes and priorities for improving access and quality. Thank you. I think we're out of time basically, but here's our website. So yeah, check us out. We're on Twitter as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, and apologies for cutting you short slightly there. We just want to make sure that we've got time for our final speaker to share her presentation as well.